Welcome to Film Forum Presents, a podcast featuring special live events recorded at our theater in downtown Manhattan, along with newly recorded interviews, conversations, and intros. In this episode, Film Forum presents a virtual roundtable discussion about the acclaimed new documentary, Capital in the 21st Century. The discussion features rock star economist Thomas Piketty, on whose best-selling book the film is based, and other experts from the movie. The roundtable was presented by the New Republic. But first, our My Film Forum segment, where we hear from you, our audience, about your favorite memories at our theater. This week, we have this submission from Paul Kaplan.
My name's Paul Kaplan, a member of Film Forum. One of my favorite recent memories is the New York City 1970s film retrospective that you put together about 2 years ago. I loved it because it grouped so many different movies under one theme, and it was almost like getting to transport in time in a way and see so many different aspects of it. I also liked it because I was sort of too young to have lived through that era, yet I heard a lot about it in terms of the edginess, in terms of when New York was sort of this crime-ridden yet interesting, fun, different place. So I never got to experience that as an adult, so seeing the films of it was a way to do that as well. I also really like the curatorship of it and the little talk that they gave before some of the films. So that was definitely my favorite series to date. Thank you.
If you would like to share your favorite Film Forum memory, we'd love to hear from you. What movie, series, event, or other happening made you love our cinema or value the communal movie-going experience? You can either record a voice note and email it to ffpresentspodcast@gmail.com or call 760-933-7082 and leave a voicemail. Again, that's ffpresentspodcast@gmail.com or call 760-933-7082. Please keep your submissions to 1 minute or less. If you would like to be attributed, please say and spell your name slowly and tell us where you are calling from. Up next, we are pleased to present an excerpt from the May 3rd roundtable discussion of the new documentary, Capital in the 21st Century, courtesy of the New Republic. The film is based on Thomas Piketty's explosive, best-selling book of the same name, about massive global economic inequality and the historical factors that got us to this point. Piketty is joined by Ian Bremmer and Gillian Tett. Ian Bremmer is the Global Political Risk Advisor and President and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. Gillian Tett is the chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large, U.S., of the Financial Times and co-founder of Moral Money. The discussion was moderated by the New Republic editor, Chris Lehman. Capital in the 21st Century is available for rental in our virtual cinema at www.filmforum.org. All rental fees support Film Forum. We hope you enjoy their discussion.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Lehman, editor of the New Republic. I'm welcoming you to the launch of the new documentary, Capital in the 21st Century, based on Thomas Piketty's best-selling book of the same name. To introduce our panelists, we have Ian Bremmer, Global Political Risk Advisor and President and founder of Eurasia Group and G0 Media. We also have Gillian Tett, who is chair of the editorial board and editor-at-large, U.S., of the Financial Times, and co-founder of Moral Money, which is also a web newsletter devoted largely to questions of green capitalism. And Thomas Piketty, the man behind the documentary we're discussing, the author of Capital in the 21st Century and Capital and Ideology. Thomas is professor at EHESS and the Paris School of Economics. So I wanted to kick off today's discussion by discussing the elephant in the room and across the world, which is the reason we're having this discussion in this format and people are seeing the movie virtually. The COVID crisis, Capital, the book, and as well as the documentary makes the case that the sort of tectonic events that occasion a more equitable distribution of capital tend to be crises and wars. The First and Second World Wars, most notably, and the Great Depression, less so, I guess, the 2008 meltdown. But the question I wanted to put to you, Tama, at the outset is, what kind of structural readjustments can we anticipate in the wake of this present crisis? We're now in a position in the United States and elsewhere where the political and financial elites are openly discussing an acceptable trade-off between what level of mass death is tolerable for our citizenry in exchange for reopening the economy. That, to me, is a very eloquent statement of the society we now live in. And I just wanted to get your impression as, someone who's studied this subject so intently in so many other settings of crises and disasters, how you see the global economy reshaping and recovering from this crisis.
Yeah, first, let me say, let me thank everybody who made this event possible. Let me say also that I did not become a film director. So the real man behind the movie is Justin Pemberton from New Zealand, who made this movie and who expressed himself with, pictures and sounds in a way that, I'm not able to, I use words, I use language of social sciences. And I think both forms of language are complementary, but he's really the one behind the movie much more than me. Now, coming to the current context, you said in history, crises and wars, can lead to movement sometimes toward equality. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they also lead to political monsters. They lead to all sorts of bifurcation and trajectories. And in my new book, Capital and Ideology, which I should apologize, it's again a very long book, but I should say it's very readable. It can be read by anyone. And this is a time when we have time, so watch movies, read books. And one general lesson from this book is that the kind of crisis like the one we have today, in the end, it's more, what kind of political mobilization and social mobilization will get us into a different set of trajectories. Because in itself, certainly this crisis is going to increase the legitimacy of a certain kind of state intervention and public investment in hospitals. I guess in most countries, people will believe after the crisis that it's, more legitimate to put resources in public health system and hospitals than they believed before the crisis, or at least we can hope that this can have this kind of impact. But over and beyond this, this crisis could lead to very different political and ideological evolution. And in history, pandemics often lead to a further closing of frontiers and mistrust of foreigners. And right. I can see already the political actors, certainly in your country, in the US, yes. But I can also see, in my country, in France, how certain political actors, there will be regional elections in France next year, and, the extreme right could do very well. And so at this stage, I think we have to be very serious about what we're going to learn from this crisis and how we're going to change the course of globalization. Because if we don't take that seriously, and after the 2008 financial crisis, we printed a lot of money in order to save the financial sector, and so we avoided the complete bankruptcy of the banking sector that we had in the 30s, which is better than nothing. But apart from that, we very much went back to business as usual very fast, and we did not really change the rules of globalization. And I think this crisis is showing us really the need to change the economic system. It's also illustrating the extreme scale and violence of inequality. So, you have people who are locked down in a very nice apartment. You have people who are locked down in a very small home. Many people who are homeless. And this raises question about, public requisition of housing and rent freeze and exactly the kind of desacralization of private property, which over time, in the 20th century, has allowed us to build a bit more equitable societies. And I think this long-run reduction of inequality has been very successful historically. So, you said in your introduction, capital wins at the end. Well, capital does not always win.
Okay.
In the long run, there is actually a reduction of inequality, in particular through the expansion of public education, public health, progressive taxation, more workers' rights. And in the long run, this has been a very successful process. And this has come with more prosperity, more productivity. And, I think we should continue in this direction. But we have to be serious about, the recovery and the way we want to change our economic system, based on this crisis and this experience we've had, since 2008 and now with this new crisis of a very different nature. Now, in the very short run, of course, the only priority is to avoid, that human casualties get, to the enormous level. It's important that we all have in mind that, according to epidemiological model, this could lead to, 40, 50 million people dying all over the world if there is no action taken, with no lockdown. And with huge social inequalities within countries and between countries about who's affected. And so that's really today's, the key priority. And, we can also talk about the next world and the next economic system. And we have to do both, but, I think we have to keep the two,
one
priorities.
sort of follow-up question I wanted to ask is that the film also tells a story of, the deconcentration of capital in the 18th and 19th century under the pressure of social revolution. That part of the story, I think, is a very difficult one, in a time of declining labor movement, activism, and membership in the United States in particular. And, part of the problem in creating this other world that I think we all want of diminished inequality and broad middle class prosperity and social mobility is politics. And right now, our political sphere is, like everything else, is shut down. So I'm wondering if you can envision, what kinds of pressures from outside capital can be exerted to render it more democratic in the way that it has been historically.
Right. I want to, in the end, I want to send an optimistic message in the sense that, of course, okay, we don't have the labor movement we had in the 20th century, but we have other forms of political mobilization and collective mobilization which are happening. And, things are changing pretty fast. If I look at the recent electoral campaign for the Democratic primary in the US, so, of course, Sanders and Warren didn't win and Biden won, but at the same time, what you could see is that proposition, like creating a federal wealth tax in the US, became very popular, in the electorate. So if you look at opinion polls, both in the Democratic electorate and in the Republican electorate, you see a lot of support for the billionaire tax idea. And this is the first time ever, this is proposed at a full scale in a US political campaign, and you get this kind of support in opinion rating. I remember 6 years ago, at the time my previous book came out, I had some public meeting with Elizabeth Warren in Boston discussing the wealth tax, and at the time, she was very cautious, and nobody was advocating that. And 4 years later, Bernie and Elizabeth Warren have been sort of competing to propose a bigger wealth tax, and it's not only in the US, like in Germany, which is another important country in the global economic debate, and which very often has been sort of very conservative in terms of economic thinking over the past 10 to 15 years. 6 years ago, when I was going to Berlin and discussing with SPD leadership, so Social Democratic Party leadership, and the finance minister at the time, Sigmar Gabriel, didn't want to hear about the possible reintroduction of a wealth tax. 3 months ago, I was in Berlin, and the new SPD leadership is competing with Die Linke and with the Green to see who is going to propose the biggest wealth tax. And right now, because of the pandemic, there's a parliamentary discussion in Germany to do, something that was already used in Germany and also in Japan after World War II, which was to have an exceptional wealth tax on very high levels of wealth. At the time, it was used to share the burden of, many people who were going back to Germany from Eastern territories, and also to reduce the enormous public debt coming from the war. And so what Japan and Germany did, which was very successful, was to have a very progressive tax on higher wealth individuals, with very low tax rate on middle class and lower wealth individuals, but on very high wealth levels going up to 50% on the stock of high wealth in Germany, up to 80-90% in Japan. And retrospectively, it allowed these countries to get rid of their public debt very fast and to invest in public infrastructure, right, education, and post-war growth. And so I'm not saying, exactly the same is going to happen today, but you can see the debate about this in both in the US, in Germany, and in other countries, that over the past 4 to 5 years, has been changing very fast. And so, instead of seeing, the limitation of this evolution, I want to stress, the potential for more evolution of this kind. And everything I see in history, and particularly in my latest book, Capital and Ideology, and that this kind of ideological change can happen always, much faster and be much more powerful than what many current, commentators, and in particular,
right. It's worth
group, tend to imagine.
Yeah, it's worth recalling, for instance, that in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt did not run on the platform of the New Deal. He was, basically forced by emergency circumstances of the sort we're now living through to adopt it as a means of both reviving and equalizing the economy. I wanted to bring in Gillian and Ian at this point too, to sort of get their impressions of this kind of fraught social moment, and how let's start with you, Gillian. How do you see the sort of issues that you've been working on over a longer compass, such as green investment, being affected by the present crisis?
Well, I thought that Thomas put a very good point on the table when he said that actually, if you look at what people like Elizabeth Warren have had as an agenda in the last few years, that was regarded as extreme and out there and almost unimaginable in the US context until very recently. But one of the very bitter ironies about the current American political situation is that although Bernie Sanders is no longer in the race, many of his ideas are essentially seeing a resurgence. And one of the things I've noticed over the years is that I trained as an anthropologist before I became a journalist. I was very much raised in the whole sort of thought of Pierre Bourdieu, the great French thinker, and things like that. And we're all basically creatures of our own environment. We all assume that the way we think is natural and inevitable and will never change. And it's not until you go and try and do the anthropological exercise of getting out of yourself and understanding a completely different culture or time in history, and then use that perspective to look back at yourself, you realize that actually nothing is inevitable in terms of how we live. Conditions do change, thought processes do change, zeitgeist changes. And as Thomas said, often changes don't appear to be happening for a long time and then suddenly shift. Yeah. It happened in 2008, where we actually had considered it almost impossible when the crisis started that you'd see some kind of, big bailout of the sector. And then suddenly it seemed inevitable. If you look at what's happening with the debate now, not just around single-payer healthcare, but things like the state getting involved in, say, the Defense Production Act and suddenly mobilizing assets, and the state getting involved in sensitive areas of technology and development, you're beginning to see this very rapid zeitgeist shift. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go towards the kind of society or policies that Thomas wants to see. We may end up with a form of state-controlled, nationalism, which would be very different from what many people who are watching would want to advocate for. But zeitgeist shifts can happen dramatically. And the last point I'd make is that one of the reasons they can often be so violent is that it's not just about economic capital, to go back to Bourdieu. It's also about social and cultural capital. And the elites tend to always try and control these, and they don't give them up lightly. But we're living through the middle of a big battle around that right now.
And Ian, Gillian raised the specter of a resurgent kind of state nationalism, and that's very much in your own wheelhouse. You're quoted in the film discussing China as one sort of vector of what capitalism may evolve into next. And I'm wondering, again, in the context of the present crisis, how you see that forecast playing out.
Well, I mean, first of all, again, I'm delighted to be with all of you and participating, because Thomas has been so prescient globally in getting this issue out there when the political leaders were unwilling to. I basically see three things happening at the same time, and the question is, which is happening fastest? On the one hand, I agree completely with Thomas and Gillian that we are seeing a number of ideas move towards acceptance in the broader political spectrum much more quickly than you would have expected. The Spain and universal basic income, Nancy Pelosi saying just a week ago she'd be willing to accept something like that. The broader green initiatives across Europe as part of stimulus and what that's going to mean. And the willingness of Biden to accept big pieces, or at least compromise in big pieces of his own platform with Bernie Sanders to ensure that he gets that support. But there are two other things that are happening at the same time. One is that inequality is growing, and it's growing a lot, and it's going to grow a lot on the back of this crisis. The people that are suffering the most under this lockdown, both in terms of the jobs they're losing and also in terms of the health they're being exposed to, the health risk, are the people that are most disadvantaged, both from a class perspective, from a race perspective here in the United States, very obviously, from a gender perspective. I mean, all of those things are happening, and our ability to dig out and the money we have to use to dig out in 3 years on the back of the worst economic contraction that the world has seen in our lifetimes is going to be a lot more challenging. I mean, so I'd like to be able to try to implement some of these political ideas when the pie was larger, not when the pie is smaller. Let's recognize that a lot of people, some of whom are very empowered, are going to be fighting over that. And then there's the broader point, the one that you just raised for me, Chris, which is that the country that right now is actually fastest out of the gate from lockdown is China. And indeed, the reason they're fastest out of the gate is because they have technologically empowered surveillance state that we could not begin to implement in the United States or in Europe, and thank God for that. But we need to understand that that means, in an absence of global leadership, even with the political backlash that we're seeing in the U.S. and other places, that China's ability to get other countries to align with their technological standards, their trade, their conditionality for the supply chain, for the lending that they do, is becoming more powerful over time, not less. In part because their economy is larger and will be larger still because they're flat this year while the Americans and Europeans are contracting, but in part because of the nature of this crisis and what it takes to get through a pandemic. And so when I look at all three of those trend lines together, I mean, obviously no one's really optimistic right now because there's no country that's better off, there's no people that's better off having gone through this pandemic than before. But I wish I could say that I feel like the trend lines are moving more in our direction. I feel like only one of the three are, and it's not necessarily the strongest one.
I'm sorry, what is the one of the three?
Well, the one that all three of us have mentioned
right.
now, the fact that we do have a broader piece of the political spectrum that's willing to at least consider, and in some cases have the capacity to begin to implement some of these solutions.
Right. One, when I read your first book, Thomas, I was left with the basic conundrum, I guess, chiefly in the American context of, yes, there is a growing sort of public sentiment behind measures like a wealth tax and greater recognition of the harm that inequality has wrought on our social fabric, at the same time, our political elites, are lagging, let's say. And it's true, yes, that Warren and Sanders made some progress along these lines, and Biden is sort of following up on that. But I'm wondering, since we are, this is the self-interested American question, we're in a polity that for 40 years has been organized around tax cuts as a panacea for any economic distress. And are there measures we can take sort of in the pre-tax economy, things like breaking the sort of monopoly of intellectual property and patent rights that can make the economy less extremely unequal prior to the intervention of the state?
Yeah, breaking monopolies is certainly part of the solution. I think the key ingredient historically has been education and labor law and sharing of power in companies. Education is really the key driver both behind equality and behind prosperity. And if the U.S. economy was the world economic leader for a long time during the 20th century, it's not because it was the leader of inequality. It's because it was the leader of education and the leader of a relative level of equality in education. In the middle of the 20th century, the US was a country with more than 90% of a generation going to high school, at a time where in Western Europe or in Japan, it was between 20 and 30%. So the US was an educational leader, and with at least more equality in educational achievements than other countries and at any other society in the past. And this is what made the US an economic leader. It was not the level of its concentration of wealth or the power of its army, whatever. Although this was also important, but the key thing was being an educational leader. And in the 1980s, there was a sort of change of narrative where somehow Reagan was able to impose a completely different narrative to the country, basically saying, no, what we need, is more concentration of wealth and economic power among a small group of entrepreneurs, and we need to, in a way, we've gone too far in the reduction of inequality, and this is why other countries have been catching up with us, which was wrong. I think if you look at it historically, countries were catching up for all sorts of other reasons, but somehow, there was this very strong and powerful message saying, we've lost, we need to go back to this sort of myth of extreme entrepreneurial 19th century laissez-faire economies. This will bring us more growth. In fact, it did not. Growth was reduced by 2. So if you look, national income per capita, the growth rate between 1990 and 2020 in the US has been 1.1%. And it was 2.2% between 1950 and 1990. It was also about 2% between 1910 and 1950, or 1870 and 1910. So the last 30 years, have been the lowest growth in history. There are probably complicated explanations behind this, the gradual exhaustion of energy resources and increase in energy prices can be one of them, in which case it's not necessarily bad to have less growth. But I don't think this is the main, this will be very important in the future. I don't think this was the main explanation for this growth slowdown. I think the main explanation was actually the stagnation of educational investment. And it's very striking if you look at the numbers. Is that as a share of GDP or national income, the total resources going toward education have been stagnating as a fraction of GDP national income in the US, but also in Europe over the past 30 years, in spite of the fact that you have a big increase in a fraction of a generation going to university, which means that investment per student has been going down. So I'm not talking, students going to Harvard, have a good investment, there's no problem, but, people who are in the bottom 50 or 60 or 70% of US colleges or universities in other countries don't get the resources they should. And, I think that's a key reason. So I think we have to go back, to change the narrative again. The problem is that in the special case of the US, the Reaganian narrative is still powerful because, you know, part of the narrative was geopolitical. You know, we are going to bring communism down, and indeed communism, you know, at the end of the Reagan decade disappeared. I don't think this was because of the domestic tax policy of Reagan, but somehow even today, you know, people still have a hard time completely changing, and that's a big question for the Democrats. You know, Joe Biden voted the Tax Reform Act of 1986, lowering down the top income tax rate to 28%, and he never really explained to which extent he has changed his mind since then. And you know, I think today could be the time, you know, to get a different direction. You know, the Democratic Party in the US has been losing middle class and lower middle class voters for many decades now. I think largely because they were not very ambitious in their social platform and redistributive platform. And you know, as you were saying, you know, this crisis can be the time to have a different kind of discourse, and you know, let's see.
Indeed, yeah, and I think we tend to forget, you know, the very, you know, platform we're having this conversation on, the internet, was something created by social investment in R&D and education on a massive scale. We would not be doing this without that, you know, direction of capital. And yeah, I wanted to pick up on something you had said earlier, how globalization has compounded the inequality crisis in our time. And I think we're also seeing right now, the pandemic is in many ways a reflection of the failures of globalization. You're seeing obviously the global supply chain being a delivery system for coronavirus in many ways, and you're seeing, you know, lagging and failed efforts in the Eurozone to contain the spread. And I wanted to again ask Gillian, since the Financial Times is a, you know, voice of
finance,
yes, how you know, we unwind that piece of the globalization piece of the present crisis. What are the incentives, as it were, that we can create to envision a different kind of economy that is, you know, more susceptible to local regulation and local control?
Well, I think it's really important when people talk about globalization to realize that there are four components of it which often get mashed together. On the one hand, you have the movement of trade and services, and that's the element people tend to focus on. Then you have the movement of money. Then you have the movement of people, and then you have the movement of information ideas, which these days is primarily through the internet. And if you look at those, I mean, there was an explosion in the movement of trade, did goods and services in the last couple of decades of the 20th century and the early part of this century, very much around the global supply chain idea going into hyperdrive all over the world. And what's interesting is that even before that, even before the 2008 crisis, there were signs that was starting to slow down. And I do think we're now seeing a major reassessment of that. And one consequence of this crisis is going to be a lot of onshoring, a lot of localization in people's focus. And that's going to be playing out over a number of years in all kinds of ways. And I think investors have barely got their heads around that yet. Mm-hmm. To me, the other interesting issues, though, are to what degree do you see the globalization of money, the movement of money across borders, be slowed down as well? My suspicion is that it will be, because I suspect we're going towards an era of what people like Carmen Reinhart call financial repression, which means trying to pay off debt by keeping interest rates below the level of inflation and potentially introducing more capital controls as well. The people movement is definitely going to be slowing down. We're seeing that already. The other interesting question, though, is the information movement. Are we going to see the globalization of information and the internet start to face a lot more controls going forward, or to be essentially splitting into different parts? We've seen elements of that already in places like China. But, you know, that to me is a lot of areas to play for. But certainly the localization of production of supply chains, coupled with growing digital technologies, which means that companies can do that more cheaply than they could before, is absolutely going to be a key theme going forward. And that's being discussed. I say the issue about capital controls and potential information controls is probably less discussed. Ian, though, knows a lot about those themes. So maybe I should throw to Ian.
Yeah, I was going to say, Ian, if we're unwinding globalization, you might be out of a job, right?
Well, I mean, my last book was about the failure of globalism.
Right,
and
as
to be
an
clear, I
ideology.
think there's a big difference between globalism and globalization. I see globalization as a massive win, but globalism is the political ideology that believes that you should promote that, but don't have to necessarily take care of the losers from the process. And that's obviously not okay. Look, I mean, globalization did not drive global inequality. Globalization gave us a global middle class. I mean, we brought, 1 billion people out of poverty that otherwise weren't. And so if you want to look at the entire distribution of human wealth, let's for a second pretend that we're not from the United States or France or the UK, and that actually we think all human beings are equally relevant for the conversation. Again, I know we don't act that way, but we can presume that we do for the conversation. And you look over the course of the last 50 years, and you have a narrow sliver at the 1%, 0.1% that's done fantastically well. But otherwise, you've gotten this incredible rise in a global middle class. And that should be welcomed. There's no question. And unfortunately, that happened while the wealthy countries were ignoring their own quote unquote middle classes, who are people that are actually very wealthy in the context of the global scheme of things, but they were allowing them to wither, allowing their social contracts to not work. And we look in the United States at the suicide rates, the life expectancy of the average person who's not in the top 10%. In the US, the world's most powerful economy, has gone down in the last few decades. Like, that's not remotely acceptable for these people. And telling them that China now has a middle class makes them vote for Trump. Right. I mean, obviously, and that's what happen. Now, what's interesting, and I think what moves in Thomas' favor and direction, is that actually even the global middle class is now, I think, going to find itself much more threatened, because the only winners that come out of coronavirus are the tech companies. I mean, as a sector, right? I mean, those are the big winners. Right now, we can still have this conversation, even though you can't go to a movie theater. Why? Because of the tech companies. This is why the economy still works, and it's also how we're going to get out of this crisis with the geo-tracing and everything else that will be required. Now, as that happens, every CEO out there is going to find ways to ensure that they can be more effective, more efficient with less labor. And so as capitalism becomes increasingly decoupled from labor, all of those people in China and India, that just-in-time supply chain that was so incredibly efficient with their low labor rates, well, that labor's gotten more expensive, and those people are more problematic for the way that the economy is going to be running in 5-10 years' time. Heck, maybe in 18 months' time. And so I think the number of people around the world that are going to find the Piketty manifesto, if you will, much more compelling in the next decade is going to be far beyond what you've seen in the United States and within the European Union in the last decade. I think that's a very important shift as we globalize this conversation. Because look, when you final point for me, when you think about something like a pandemic, or you think about something like a climate crisis, these are global crises. They require a globalized response, not an American response, not a European response. It's not just about your social safety net. And the reason we're failing right now to deal with the pandemic is precisely because we can't do a global medical supply chain. We're blaming each other. We can't, and when the virus vaccine actually comes, and it's probably made by the United States, but for 6 months, 12 months, it's not available to other countries around the world, we're going to see just how deep that rabbit hole goes. Climate change is much more obvious and much more existential in that regard. So again, I think this is exactly the time to be really sort of chewing over these incredibly challenging and difficult issues.
For the full roundtable discussion, please head to the New Republic's Facebook page. Thank you for listening to Film Forum Presents. Special thanks to the New Republic and Kino Lorber for making this episode possible. If you like what you just heard, Please be sure to subscribe to get future episodes and rate and review so that more movie lovers can find us. Film Forum is an independent nonprofit cinema, and our doors have been kept open for nearly 50 years thanks to the invaluable support of our members and donors. Please visit www.filmforum.org for details on membership, as well as information and showtimes for our current programming. See you at the movies.